Hi everybody, welcome to Esther's podcast. I'm chuffed to bits today to be joined by the marvellous Joel Smirnoff. Now, you may well have heard of him. If you haven't heard of him, you will have heard him playing as leader of the Julliard String Quartet. He's also the president of the Cleveland Institute of Music. He's a former chair of the Juilliard Violin department. He's a conductor, a soloist, a composer, a jury member for lots of international competitions. And he's also a jazz musician. And he's had solos featured on the Grammy Award-winning CD by Tony Bennett, sings Ellington Hot and Cool. So he really does get about, don't you, Joel? But perhaps we could start by talking about your life when you started out in the world. You were actually a ballet dancer as well as a musician, and I wondered which interest came first in your life.
Well, I only came. Hello, everybody, and by the way, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. And I'm always very, very interested in speaking to our audience, especially to young people who are struggling to master the art. You know, of whether it's a violin playing or music in general, both hopefully. No, I was ballet dancing. I came to very, very late, and actually came through modern dancing. My parents were both musicians. My mother was a jazz singer. My father was a quartet player, actually, and dabbled in the pop field. Excuse me. As a kid, I think I listened to about as much jazz, or maybe more jazz, than classical music when I was very, very, very young. And of course, I loved the beat. I loved the swing of it. I loved the fact that culture was front and center in it in some way, and it seemed pretty contemporary. Then I found a violin, and I went to a music school, which was quite unusual. And this is really, I think, a little bit of what I want to touch on today. I went to a music school where the instrumental teaching was rotten. It was absolutely, I wouldn't say worthless, but it was entirely amateurish. And so by the time I was 11, I still played the violin. It was kind of on my chest. It was kind of like this. And I could kind of play, but not really. But what they did have, the head of that school was a woman named Ann Holden. And Ann Holden had studied in, I'm sure she was a pianist. We never really knew what instrument she played. That was a bit mysterious. And she was a very fierce and disciplined and not particularly child-oriented person, I have to say, considering what the business that she was in. She taught in a very old brownstone, what we call brownstone in New York. The school, it was called School of Musical Education. They owned a brownstone about 3 or 4 stories high in a terrible neighborhood. People used to have to walk me out of that neighborhood. There was drugs, all sorts of stuff going on. Okay. Obviously, they got it at a good price, you know, and that's why they were there. So Ann Holden, who ran the school, was a theory genius. And she had a very specific way of teaching theory. She did it chronologically so that you learned the rules of voice leading from the very, very earliest organum, and you got more stricter and stricter and stricter. And she trained you to hear inversions, of which there are only 7. In other words, you have, of the triadic chords, you only have 3 inversions, and then you have 4 versions of the 7 chords. Those are your 7 inversions. If you could hear, her theory was that if you could hear those, identify them, no matter how wide the voicing, how close the voicing, no matter what note is on top, then you begin to think like a composer, and then you begin to hear music in its complete verticality. She was brilliant. We all wrote good fugues at the age of 11. Wow. And so, of course, the end result of that, I mean, that was transformative. Of course, early on when I entered the school when I was 7, we were beating on drums and singing silly songs. Younger than springtime, are you? I mean, it's funny stuff, you know, Lerner and Lowe and Rodgers and Hammerstein, all this stuff. But she wanted us to sing. Singing was very, very important. It was a bit Kodai-ish. She wanted us to move. We did all that, but in addition, it was very comprehensive. We could write a fugue at 11 with absolutely perfect voice leading. And for the rest of your childhood, what happens is then you encounter Beethoven 7, you encounter, you start to play quartets, you encounter Brahms, you know, the power of Brahms. And you you are able to hear it in a way which is very active and which be able to which enables you to distinguish at the molecular level how these pieces are put together. And I credit Ann Holden with everything that I've achieved musically, to be honest. I mean, not violinistically, because they couldn't do that. Luckily for me, my father died, unfortunately, when I was 5. So I didn't come under his influence at all, even though I had an accordion, a kind of a plastic fiddle, and I was, you know, and I could play the piano. I was improvising on the piano. But I went to study with what had been his best friend, Harry Glickman, who was an amazing fiddle player. He'd been an assistant concertmaster at the NBC Symphony and a very disciplined guy. And he led, there was a string quartet that played over the radio, WQXR, which is the New York Times station in New York. And they played on Saturday nights. I'd have my lesson in the radio studio. And that guy, I looked through the window, guy next to me was reading the news. I thought, this is cool, you know. I'd be playing my D major 3-octave scale. And he was trained, he was a Polish Jew, trained at the Paris Conservatory, and was a student of Paul Kochanski, of course, for whom the Szymanowski Concerto was written, and he wrote the cadenza for it. It was rigorous scales, octave scales, third scales, sixth scales, 10th scales, from the time I was 11. And Kreutzer, you know, and then whatever piece seemed appropriate. But every week I was fed a new 3-octave major or minor scale until we got through all 24.
Did you not rebel? I would have rebelled at age 11.
Oh no, I swallowed this whole. In other words, I became an obsessive scale practicer. I practiced scales 2.5 hours every night from the time I was 11 for quite a few years. And I was convinced, because I could see the immediate transformation of my left hand and of my right hand. Because not only do we practice scales for intonation, we also practice them for the left hand technique. We practice them for bow division. And we practice them for legato, because legato is a technique of lyricism in music. Without legato, there is no lyricism. We have a lot of players, and especially pianists out there today, who are quite popular, who don't understand this. You know, and unfortunately on the piano, if you don't have a finger legato, you will not hear the harmonies. The harmonic voice leading will not happen. It just won't happen.
Do you feel, yeah. Sorry, I was going to say, do you feel that your mum being a jazz singer helped with that? Because I'm married to a jazz musician, and ever since I've been with him, I have felt music. I felt the line of the music so much more easily.
Yeah. I'm absolutely. Jazz and my mother's love of jazz and the presence of that in our, somehow, and the thing, she wasn't singing by the time. She gave up singing really to have kids and have a family. Then she became a businesswoman. She had a very interesting life, and she's still alive, did a lot of different stuff. But when we go back and we think about, you know, if we had our time machine and we could go back and listen to Bach or Beethoven improvise or Mozart, you know, and we know that if we could hear them improvise, it would give us insights that would be absolutely, you know, we would have an understanding of their music, which would be very, very different. But we have to keep in mind that they were improvisers. And that these pieces, much like the recording of a great jazz player, you know, some of the famous solos, like the Miles Davis solo in My Funny Valentine, 1964, which I did a class on last summer for Itzhak. Actually, I transcribed it. I talked about the fact that it was because, you know, the Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd thing were happening so big and horrible over here. And we want something, and I thought this was relevant because that great performance was they didn't get paid for that night, and it was a benefit for the NAACP, which was one of the old, you know, civil rights organizations.
Yeah.
So, and that was certainly part of the tension of that night, because Miles told them just before they went on stage, these were a bunch of young guys, you know, Tony Williams, the drummer, was about 18. They were all really young. Ron Carter and Herbie Hancock, of course. He said, "You're not getting paid for the night." And they were so pissed. They went out, they were so angry. And somehow the tension you
It
know,
works.
was explosive. It worked, and out of it came two albums. But certainly, music wants to be is a very is one of our most important means of communication. And children know this. Little children, you know, they're going to move, they're going to dance, they're going to sing, they have no inhibition, and they know that it's a part of their DNA. The ability at the tribal level to coordinate, to communicate, is musical, basically. And so, you know, if we don't somehow, if we aren't able to get from the stage over the footlights, if we're going to be on a stage, there has to be something spontaneous that happens every night. You know, I'm a huge fan, does not quite say it, of Milstein, of Nathan Milstein.
Yeah.
And it becomes very obvious to me when I listen to, there's a recording of the Mendelssohn Concerto with Asserme and the Swiss Romande Orchestra from 1959. And then he recorded it in a video with Chicago Symphony a few months after that. And the bowings everything is entirely different. It's very obvious to me. And you know, when Pinky interviewed him, there's a Pinky Zuckerman interview of Milstein where Pinky says, and I think this is from Christopher Nupin's film. Do you know Christopher?
Oh, yes, I know the one you mean. Yes, yeah.
I love Christopher Nupin. He's a wonderful man and friend. Okay. And Pinky asked him, you know, I'd love to see your music. Where do you keep your music and your fingers and bowings? And Milstein looked at his guy and says, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have any music with fingerings and bowings. So my impression was the manner in which he stayed fresh and entertained himself playing the Tchaikovsky Concerto for the nth time was to obviously not take chances which were going to destroy him, but to be able to move flexibly and spontaneously in the moment. You know, one of the really highlights of my whole career has been, and you mentioned it, has been performing with Tony Bennett, who is sadly, you know, he's quit performing, and he's not an he's a very good vocal public voice for Alzheimer's now. He's 95, going on 96, and gave his last performance last summer at Radio City. I played night after night with this guy on the road, and I can tell you, and at times we didn't play. We were just, he would do something with piano. He liked to turn the mic off and just sing in a hall with the piano without a mic to show that he was actually trained as a bel canto singer, which he was. And the voice teachers of the world will always tell you that he's the one pop singer who was properly trained, and that's why he could sing for so many years. You know, and if you listen to his early recordings, he sings incredibly long phrases in one breath. It's kind of mind-boggling. It's like listening to one of the great opera singers. So we would just sit there and he would sing Sunny Side of the Street or Sophisticated Lady just with piano. It was entirely different every night.
Oh,
different notes, different feeling, different communication, and a different angle on the lyric, different emphasis.
Yeah.
Amazing artist.
This may sound like a rude question. It's not meant to be, but when he did that, when he was able to just go off on one,
always.
Are you a good enough jazz violinist to be able to respond? I mean, I don't know. It all looks amazing.
No, I'm going to give you a recommendation. If you go on YouTube, there is a video of Fly Me to the Moon with me standing right in front of him. Okay? Yes. Yeah, it's me and him, basically. We're so proud of this. This is from about 20 years ago or 21 years ago when I was, you know, he would have been already 73 or 74, something like that.
Spring chicken.
Yeah, and sounding amazing. And we didn't really rehearse it.
Really?
This was at Sony Studios in New York in front of a big audience. It was a live by request, actually. So it was the whole thing had a very spontaneous feel about it. But we just ran it that afternoon, and that was it. You know, we got a kind of a sound check version of it. They got their levels, and we ran it. And I went home, put on a suit, and, you know, more or less prayed, if you want to say that, to the people God. And I'm very proud of it because it's entirely, you know, spontaneous on the part of both of us.
Yeah.
And it is a snapshot. What I wanted to say about jazz performances like this, like that one. These people played every night. If you talk about Miles Davis or Tony, great jazz singer, Dizzy Gillespie, Parker, all these guys, and gals now. We have more and more. Always have been, Mary Lou Williams. One session or one night is a snapshot. It's really just a quick snapshot of an ongoing progression of learning and expanding and continuing to grow on the part of these artists. And that's so important. If you don't grow, you're going to get worse. It's just going to happen. You don't stand still. It never happens.
Which do you feel more natural with, that free improvisatory style and permission to improvise so much in the jazz world, or the more structured, let's face it, even though we'd like it not to be, the more structured classical style? Which, if you had to choose?
Well, I hate to shock you, but I don't feel any different about it. I mean, it's a different part of the brain when you're improvising, obviously, because you're actually, generating notes and phrases. But I never felt constricted. And one of the virtues of the Julliard Quartet was that this is the way in which they operated. And they really tried to explain this to me when I first joined them as second violin to the great Robert Mann. We had so much fun, and it was a great honor for me to be sitting next to someone who I'd grown up listening to, and to be matching sounds with. I mean, it was kind of freaky, It's a little strange when you've grown up listening to somebody's Ravel string quartet in sound, and then you're kind of inserted into that. It's just one of the great. I mean, it was just joyous. It was just thrilling, and a wonderful man. And we were very, very close. And had just one of these relationships where he didn't really particularly have to talk. What we would do would be we would explore in the course of and discuss if we needed to, but a lot of not terribly verbal exploration, and things would kind of evolve in the course of rehearsal to a certain point, and then we understood that we had to get on the stage at that point. We could not go any further, and then the stage. The experience of communicating was going to demand things which were not demanded, and the reality of that was going to put a demand on us which did not exist in the rehearsal room. And then I think, for instance, we had an all-star program my very first year, which was Mozart 575, Bartok Fifth Quartet, and Opus 131 Beethoven. Okay, so everybody wanted that program. Everybody, whether we were in Germany or Italy or Japan, they wanted that program. We must have played it, and we were given about 100 concerts in 9 months those days. So we were on the road all the time. And I was young, and I was just, I had a stomach problem from the stress of it, but I didn't care. It didn't matter. Every time we played that program, it was different. Yeah. It really was different. And that's how the group operated. They wanted to grow. They wanted to have new insight every day. They were not satisfied to replicate, particularly. It wasn't going to happen. And I think my favorite artists have some of that. So for me, there's not much of a division between the jazz playing and the jazz playing. You're looking for new licks all the time. If you listen to another jazz player, he make you listen for a lick to steal, and a lick, of course, is a small phrase. But I think I gave an interesting class one time when I was just beginning to teach the fiddle at Juilliard, seriously, with a great class. There were fantastic fiddlers in the class, and I said, "Look, come in early. I want you to listen to a bunch of stuff." So they all arrived about 8 o'clock in the morning, and I brought in really some of my favorite jazz solos. And I said to them, today we're going to do this together. We're going to explore and listen to the way a jazzer who's actually making up the notes in real time phrases. What do the phrases sound like? How do they advocate their phrases? Or do they need to at all? Where does it come from? And by the end of that class, they didn't want to listen to anything class. It was so weird. They kind of got it, the fact that this process of creating in real time just necessitated phrase. There was no way of playing without phrase.
Yes.
It couldn't be done. Whereas, of course, in our field, we have people who come up who have fantastic techniques, and they've never really learned a phrase. They don't think in terms of phrase, you know. So that was kind of important. And it was important for me to watch the effect that it had on these guys and gals, you know.
Yeah. So your jazz training, if we call it like that, that must have started initially then in that very first music school, that understanding of the
I think so.
inversions of the chords, etc. But you must have had some other help somewhere along the way.
Okay. I had a job, which really, I don't know if I'd call it a job. It's more like slavery. I was enslaved by my brother. My brother, who's about 3 years older than I am, was trying to be a jazz sax player, and he was a very talented clarinet player. He went to the same music school, but his clarinet teacher was actually good. And he was a wonderful clarinetist, fantastic intonation, gorgeous sound, huge chops. And but he tried to play the sax, and he ended up in Mercer Ellington's band briefly. And my job was to play the changes for all the standard tunes all afternoon for him. That's how I learned all those tunes, all those jazz tunes, and all those kind of standard ballads that, you know, whether it's Body and Soul or Stardust or those kind of things.
Yeah.
But I had, of course, from the music school, this was no sweat. I mean, I had the ability to hear harmony so easily that it was not, you know, I mean, it was a job and it was enslavement, but it was not a difficult job or a difficult job. Yeah. So that was a lot of it. And then I went to University of Chicago. I put the violin down. This is where my background really diverges from most people. I'd had enough of music by the time I got to high school. I had been so saturated in it. And I somehow got myself into University of Chicago as a history major. And I put the fiddle down.
Completely.
I didn't take a lesson for 6 years.
Wow, really? And so that was at what age? 18?
17.
Wow.
Yeah. I decided I needed to learn a bunch of things. And I credit, and this is something which I have a real concern. It's something which concerns me a lot about young musicians, is I don't think musical training as it is taught very often engenders enough education, the ability to analyze, the ability to organize one's thoughts. And I think that that university education, and I had certain teachers who opened new worlds for me. One of them I'm still in touch with, Bill Carpenter. He's a novelist, poet, lives up in Maine, where he's from originally. Incredibly inspiring teacher, demanding. I mean, we were writing papers, you know, all the time. And it was a place where you just had to understand the significance of really being able to think in order to be able to have a democracy. I mean, we suffer, you know, in this world of misinformation and purposeful misinformation, so that money can be made and so that power can be held, which we're all experiencing today. The only reason this can happen is because people are not able to distinguish truth from falsehood. And it's a very, very serious problem. And it's a problem for the musician, because the musician today needs to be able to find their audience. They need to be able to advocate for themselves. They need to be able to speak, and they need to be able to communicate, not only musically. And they need to be able to really think about the music that they're playing and understand the larger context. And this is, I'm still struggling to do this myself. It never ends. I mean, we never stop being a student, you know, really, of life. So that was so important for me, this experience, and being around people who were not musicians and whose lives were going to take a trajectory which they may not have known at the time, but you know, the people who I roomed with and who I was friends with, one of them became a lawyer for the Justice Department, a very important guy, a land and natural resources lawyer, head of a department. Another guy became one of the big emergency crisis doctors in New York City, Greg Husk. These were, you know, and these were people who who really had a sense of community and culture. I mean, we have a problem in the United States, which is that we are an emigre society, of course, and we don't have, as you do in the UK, you have a minister of culture.
You don't have one in America?
Are you kidding? No way. The word culture does not exist over here. You know, I gave a class when I'm no longer president of Cleveland, you know that. I stepped down in 2016, and went back to being a musician, which was wonderful. Yeah, but I learned a lot, and I enjoyed my time in Cleveland, and in wonderful school, and great experience for me. We actually, the issue of culture became very obvious to me. You know, you're in an international school. You've got your Europeans, you've got your Asians, you've got your South Americans, you've got Americans, and I was called over to Case to do a class with their honors. I forget what they call it, their honors class. And I decided off the top of my head, I really didn't prepare for it. I said, okay, what's culture? I asked them. And most of them were kind of scratching their heads, you know. The Asians, they knew what it was, you know. And the one African American girl in the class, they knew this word. But interestingly, the Americans themselves had not really encountered it, even though they may have known something about culture.
Yeah, I was going to say they don't know the word, but they have culture, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You don't recognize it as such.
That's right. But it's a very, very important word, obviously, and it's the music that we play and that we love and that we've learned all our lives is absolutely suffused, you know, and informed by it, and you know, it's that was a very revealing class to me. And so what we did was we started a cultural seminar at Cleveland Institute. And what we tried to do was to have students come in and investigate their own heritage, investigate the music the pop music they were listening to on their smartphones, think about culture in relationship to the music that they're studying. Yeah. And kind of triangulate those three things, and begin to understand that within the United States we have, and there's good and bad culture. It's not that culture is wonderful. There's terrifying culture. There's you know, there's bad stuff. Mm. We have to understand it. We have to understand what the culture of various communities is. And then all of a sudden, music becomes a mode of transportation for that culture, and always has been. Yeah. Always has been.
What's always I've loved about American universities is it seems to me that you don't specialize as early as we do. If you go to a British university, you go to study one thing, yeah. History, English, maths, whatever, music, and you're just studying that one thing. Whereas I'm right, am I, in thinking in America, you study lots of other things as well along the way. And
Go ahead.
So I think that's really fantastic, yeah, because of what you just said. And it's always struck me that when you have music conservatoires, that they are too narrow-minded. Obviously, it's really necessary to spend that time, but I wish that somehow we could have music conservatoires where you can learn at that incredibly high standard in a very sort of, you know, intensive way, but still have that more sort of overarching cultural experience, and you know, mixing with other people from, you know, studying different things, different ideas. I don't know, for me the music conservatoire experience, probably by my own fault, was far too technical violin, and I wished I had opened my mind a little bit more, especially at that very formative time in my life.
Right. Well, you know, my story was that I went to Chicago when I went to the university, and then I went back to Juilliard when I was 24.
Okay.
In other words, I kind of put things a little bit backwards, but I needed those university years badly in order to be able to have to understand the music making process in a larger context.
And so, was there a special moment where you thought, "Oh God, I missed the violin"? How come you went back to the violin? I presume you'd completely stepped away, not planning to come back to it.
Well, it was a bit of a zigzag. I mean, I picked up the fiddle real fast during my second year so I could get a job.
Ah, good idea.
I needed some money, so I joined the Grand Park Orchestra, which was this terrific job. It was a great, we played two different programs a week. Each one got two rehearsals. It was moving real fast. And had a wonderful conductor, Erwin Hoffman, who may he rest in peace. I don't know if you know the cellist, Gary Hoffman.
Oh, yes, yes.
Well, that's his dad.
Okay.
Right. And his
Yeah.
Joel Hoffman is a good friend of mine. That's his son, who's a composer. And who actually is nominated for a Grammy for an interesting concerto for violin and traditional Chinese orchestra.
Ooh.
Joel has done a fantastic thing, which is to span really, he's done what, you know, the Chinese, the Asians have learned Western culture.
Yes.
Many of us have actually tried to learn something about Asian. This guy actually went, a big presence in Beijing, and he's a great guy. We've been friends forever. Big jazz fan. We used to go to hear Mingus together when we were in Juilliard together. Great guy. So Ern was the conductor. I needed to, and then I put the violin down again. I had my summer, played 16 different programs of the Rite of all my favorite pieces, the Rite of Spring. Because I was always into Stravinsky and Bartok and Prokofiev when I was very young, and got to play some of those things. And then I joined an R&B blues band in Chicago, of course, which is a blues center. And you know, the cool thing about Chicago was you had an extant urban folk music. In other words, there was a guy named J.B. Hutto who I got to know, who was a construction worker. And on the weekends at night, he played what we call bottleneck guitar. That's where they put a little kind of like, they call it a bottleneck, but it's a piece of work. And the Stones have done this quite a bit, you know, Keith Richards. And that was right near the university, by the way, in the black communities. So I heard a lot of blues, and I joined a band playing keyboards, doing that. And we had some fun things. We almost became Janis Joplin's band. We auditioned to be Janis Joplin's band at a certain point.
Wow.
But you know, that kept
my hand. And there was, and we have to touch on it, there was ballet, and I need to hear about the ballet in your life.
So that was, I had a friend, a woman, very young woman, who I was giving some fiddle lessons to. She was not a girlfriend, but she was a friend of our little circle of folks I knew at University of Chicago. And she was a wonderful dancer. She was very young. And she said, and I kept asking her about her dancing in her class. She said, why don't you come to a class? So she invited me, and I went to this, and the teacher's name was Joanna Hall. Joanna Hall was a Merce Cunningham trained dancer, and some Graham technique also. And I'd been I was on the track team at University of Chicago, a sprinter. I was really fast, which I loved. In the middle of the winter, it was great. So I went to the dance class, and I thought, this is amazing. This is the greatest exercise I've ever, and Joanna Hall was brilliant teacher. And I became just addicted to going to dance class. It's not so much that I was interested in the dancing, but I thought the centering and the aligning of the body and the sense of direction, sense of balance, this was something I'd never experienced.
It's the full body experience of your scale thing that you had when you were.
Yeah, exactly. I always looked kind of sloppy, even when I went to Juilliard, to the extent that Dorothy DeLay, who I had the great honor of studying with, said to me at a certain point, because I had the body of a dancer at that time, but I was wearing just crappy looking clothes. And she said, Joel, you look great in clothes. I said, well, what am I wearing?
What a waste.
She was always dressed very elegantly.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was the beginning of it. And then I got to play for ballets, which was so interesting. At that time, the Joffrey Ballet was a very interesting company and very diverse. It was very multicultural. They had every size, shape, ethnicity of dancer in that company purposefully. Many of them came out of the New York Performing Arts School, School for the Performing Arts. And they were doing rock ballets, as a matter of fact, some of which were quite wonderful. Yeah. And I began to, what I would do is I would just hang around in the afternoon, watch them rehearse. I don't know if you know about the Auditorium Theater in Chicago. That's the most beautiful grand theater in the States. Louis Sullivan, who was this architectural genius in Chicago, who basically designed the very first skyscraper. Amazing. designed what had been a combination hotel and concert hall. And now it's Roosevelt University downtown. It's a gorgeous building. And the auditorium theater, which is kind of a big hall and has perfect acoustics, is a stunning, absolutely stunning hall. And here I was sitting alone in the middle of the main floor watching this wonderful process. And I fell in love with, the whole, I began to understand what dance was all about. And then I got to play all sorts of interesting stuff. I played White Swans I played the very first Apollo that Baryshnikov ever danced, and had the opportunity of rehearsing with him on the stage, because the birth of Apollo is a violin solo in the Stravinsky. And they said, I heard over the intercom, Mr. Baryshnikov would like the concertmaster on the stage. This is in the Civic Opera House, Chicago. So I went up there. There's Baryshnikov, in his prime, about to go to NYCB. He went from American Ballet Theater to the City Ballet because he wanted to work with Balanchine. And but this was a ballet festival in Chicago. And he looked at me. I said, "Hi, I'm Joel Smirnoff." He looked at me and he says, "Smirnoff is not a Jewish name." And so that was my introduction. And then I played for him for about an hour.
Oh, incredible.
One of the great moments. So, things kind of there was this melange of music and dance and playing a lot of ballets and playing Nureyev. I got to play the Schumann A major quartet, the Clara quartet, for Nureyev. It was a Hans von Mannen choreography called Four Schumann Pieces. Oh. So we did that 8 times a week for a while. It was wonderful. So my career, I've had, what can I say?
You've had a good time.
Yeah, I've done so many different things, and I'm very, a lot of it is luck. You've got to have the talent. You've got to be prepared. You've got to, and as I say, I credit Ann Holden and my violin teacher who made me understand that without intonation, I say to my students all the time, you can never stop thinking about intonation, and of course it has to be harmonically based, and that's what I teach. I teach a very specific, well-organized version of it. The idea being that if you can hear the harmonic function of every note that you play, and that's what's demanded of a quartet player. Yeah. Am I playing the root? Am I playing the fifth? Am I playing the third? What am I playing? What is this note? Then you begin to color those notes for their harmonic function. And it's very, very important. If you're playing a root of a chord in a quartet, it's got to be heard by everybody. You have to send it into the group.
Yeah.
So all that information, and by the way, my father was a quartet player. My teacher was a quartet player. I coached with the Budapest when I was 16. I was lucky to be asked to read through all the Haydn quartets over the course of 2 years on Friday nights by a couple of doctoral candidates. I was 13.
13.
So, the training, we think of training as being school oriented or to happen in school, but I often say to the students who want to be chamber players, it may not happen in school. It's going to happen in somebody's house, in your house or somebody else's house, and it's going to be something social. You're going to gather to share this music together and to try to understand it. Yeah.
So you've also obviously loads and loads of chamber music happening in your life there, but you then, how long ago? I don't know, 20 years ago, started conducting.
Yeah.
What made you want to be the man on the box with no friends?
I didn't want to be that person. Here's what happened. And it was, I was teaching chamber music at Tanglewood Festival in the summers. I was in the quartet. I had been a member of the Boston Symphony for 6 years with Ozawa. And they knew, they used me in funny ways. I played orchestra piano and celesta for them. Sometimes under great duress. Yeah. And I had the nerve to do it, and I had enough pianism about me to be able to, at the very least, get through what I needed to get through. But Seiji kind of knew what I was capable of doing. And what happened was I got a call I was about to leave for Tanglewood to go up from New York and coach, for the summer. I got a call from Richard Ortner, who recently passed, and a great administrator, became head of the Boston Conservatory, great man. But he was administrating Tanglewood. He said, Seiji wants you to do the string sectionals for him in 4 days on the bare 3 pieces for orchestra.
Oh, God.
And Beethoven 7, bare 3 pieces for orchestra, and something else I forget. I said, well, okay, I'll see if I can get the scores and get it together. So I did it.
Well done.
Yeah, and there I was on the stage of the Shed, what we call it in Tanglewood. Have you ever been there?
No, I'm an Aspen girl myself, sorry.
Oh, you did Aspen. Well, the Shed is quite a wonderful historic place. Has a lot to do with Kuzovitsky, who started the festival, and Eero Saarinen, very famous Finnish architect who designed it. And then over the course of 3 years, basically, Ozawa used me as his assistant, not only with the strings, and then started to ask me to conduct. Already I was conducting in the Festival of Contemporary Music there, because he knew I was a music guy. And that's a whole other story, but that started back in Chicago when I was 21, in Ralph Shapey's group in the Contemporary Chamber Ensemble, Contemporary Chamber Players of University of Chicago. So eventually there was a Leonard Bernstein Memorial program where I conducted Leonore 3, Seiji conducted Songfest of Bernstein, and Bob Spano conducted The Rite of Spring. That was the program. And that was kind of my big coming out, Yeah. And it was something, the more I mean, you start out, even no matter whether you're young or old, and conducting is not the easiest thing. And luckily, Ozawa he was so physically talented that he could, in a very cruel way, imitate you. Oh. And imitate students with a slight bit of exaggeration in the conducting class at Tanglewood, and he was charming, but there was some invective there. So, but he was very, very kind to me and very appreciative, and we worked very closely together on the Tanglewood Festival, not the BSO obviously, but the conservatory level orchestra all summer.
Yeah.
Great experience.
Well, we talked about the freedom of when you're playing jazz and quartet music and all that kind of stuff, but when you're conducting a big symphony orchestra, how much freedom do you feel in the moment, in the concert? Are you one of these conductors who needs to have it all planned out? Do you trust the band and fingers crossed? How does it work for you?
Well, look, your job, I see conducting very specific, and Ozawa, this is interesting, Ozawa also articulated this. He said, you have to invite people to play. And, you never point, you never give a cue like this, ever.
What would you do? This? What do you do?
You can do this. In the great Fritz Reiner, Lenny Bernstein was a student of Reiner at Curtis. And Reiner had these he looked like an owl, these big eyes, which of course used to frighten people to death because he had a terrible reputation. But it's all done pretty much with the eyes. You engage with the eyes of the player who's about to play before they play, and you invite them with your eyes. So you have to get used to, and getting there early always for anything that's about to happen. That's part of the technique. And then in terms of leadership styles, there are people, a lot of conductors, when they're young, I think there are a lot of people who just are looking for control, and that's not me. I could never be a chamber player and do that. It would never work. So what I try to do is to somehow inform the orchestra of what they should be listening to at any given moment, so that they can play as chamber players.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good.
So, and a lot of the time, what are we talking about? It's going to be the bass. It's going to be the bass line. It's going to be celli bassi. So the really great conductors in history have always focused on having the celli bassi move the harmonic furniture around.
Yeah.
Because if the orchestra is listening to the right person, they don't need the conductor, because that section is going to lead the orchestra. And I will say, you lead the orchestra at this point. and I will say to them. And so eventually, what is the conductor's job is to show phrase. There has to be phrase at every moment, no matter how loud you're playing, no matter whether it's the rite of spring or not, there has to be phrase.
Okay, so I have one word for you there then, Elgar. Have you
Yes.
conducted any Elgar? So the phrases are so what
Well,
do you do there then?
with Brahms so much, because with Brahms, phrases kind of dovetail into each other, correct?
Yeah.
It comes from Brahms. And Schoenberg loved that about Brahms too. I'm trying to think, have I conducted the cello concerto kind of badly.
Well, the cello takes care of that. I'm talking like Elgar 1 or something. There's a challenge for 2022 for you, Joel.
Yeah, I would love to.
Let us know when you do it. So I
love it.
have to say, you did you played the Berg Violin Concerto with the late great Bernard Haitink in a memorial concert about Louis Krasner, and I have to say, the lovely Bernard, I mean, one of the greatest gentlemen on the rostrum ever, I think. You were talking about that, inviting people to play. It immediately made me think of him. It must have been amazing. How was that, playing Berg with him?
Oh, it was a great honor. I mean, it was there for lots of reasons. It was a very special evening because Louis Krasner was someone who had encouraged me and who I knew very, very, very well, and who made me practice the Schoenberg Concerto. I was living across the road from him at Tanglewood, and he was coming down to my cabin and saying, "Okay," you know. But he was a wonderful man, wonderful coach, funny guy. But a wonderful human being, and this was a memorial for him, and the family was there, and I mean, it was really there was so much love in the room that night for him and for the piece and for the relationship between him and the piece and the history. And you know what I did for that performance? Of course, one of the great Berg experts and advocates was American composer George Pearl, and George Pearl, a very talented composer who died. I don't think that recently, but a lovely man. I actually worked it with him. In other words, I had many, many sessions with George Pearl, weeks leading up to that performance, because I wanted to, I just wanted to, you know, get everything I could out of the experience. Yeah. Wonderful. So, yeah, never to be forgotten. Never to be forgotten. Yeah.
You're also a jury member on many international competitions. You're off to Singapore next week. Good luck with the PCR tests. That'll be great. Tell me, and this is a silly question really, but I've got to ask it. What do you look for in somebody who plays in a competition? What's the magical thing that, if you could put your finger on one thing you're looking out for in somebody in a competition situation?
You know, it's I'll hark back to what I said initially, which is I think that the most important thing that we communicate is lyricism, our most important technique, which represents love, obviously, the ability to love, the ability to, and there are different kinds of love. You know, Beethoven's love was very different from Brahms' sense of lyricism. And the Beethoven was a very interesting one because it's very lofty, it's very societal, it's very kind of elevated in its way. You know, his slow movements are usually not love movements. They are societal statements of some kind, and yet they have love in them. And somehow lyricism always, no matter how, I'll give you an example. One of the greatest orchestral trumpet players of all time, Bud Herseth, Chicago Symphony, was there for 45 years, something like that. Could play louder than anyone, and that brass section was a very big, loud brass section. Could play softer than anyone. Just a huge natural talent. There's always lyricism in the sound, no matter how, whether it's Tchaik 4 or Shostakovich 7, doesn't matter. And the same with the gods, Milstein, Heifetz. There's always a lyrical element that is communicating to the listener, I'm with you, and I share with you the joys, sorrows, and challenges of being a human being struggling to survive and struggling to live a good life. And I'm going to meet life's challenges with lyricism and with intelligence and with realism. But basically, the ability, I wrote after Van Cliburn died a Facebook post because I'd gotten to, when I was president of Cleveland, we invited him for an honorary doctorate, and he came, and he was quite sick. He was about to die, I think. And he put himself out for us, and he was an amazing person. And I've always been a huge fan of his, especially when he had just won Tchaikovsky and came back, and it just amazing, and went through so much repertoire. There was a person who could give. How much can you give, And it's hard to expect that of young people. I mean, their minds, who knows where their minds are when they're up there in very often, which seems like an antiseptic situation.
Yeah.
And yet, there are performances from those situations which are complete and which are coherent and which are lyrical. And to be able to be lyrical in the face of adversity, this is what we struggle to do, no matter how nervous you are, no matter how long you've traveled in the course of a day. To present, a fugue of Opus 131, there's one of the great Beethoven statements, Yeah, because it's less important that it's a fugue than of what it says about life's kaleidoscopic alignments.
Well, I really hope that you get to hear some of that in Singapore next week. It's so fantastic to talk to you again, Joel. Thank you so much for joining me. And we hope that if you ever make your way to windy, wet Britain, please do pop by and see us. But thank you so much.
I so enjoy always, being in the UK, and I hope that we're all healthy very, very soon, so we can gather and share life.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Joel.
You, Nicole, so appreciate it. Be well.